Thank you for joining me today for this presentation on deathbed phenomenon, its effects on the dying and family caregivers. My name is Christopher Vinson. I am a Ph.D. student in psychology theology here at Liberty University. I also hold a Master's of Divinity, a Bachelor's in Ministry from Trifecta Nazarene University, an Associate's in Engineering from Nashville State Tech. I currently work as an engineer, a chaplain, and a pastor. There is a rich history around end-of-life dreams and visions and deathbed phenomenon in general. It is death that has sparked human curiosity about what comes after. Is there an afterlife? These are often questions associated with religious practices. However, over the last decade, psychological studies have grown tremendously about end-of-life phenomenon experiences. A lot of this was led by Dr. Peter Fenwick. I don't directly reference Dr. Peter Fenwick's work here in this PowerPoint presentation. However, in most of the articles I have cited, they themselves in their references are building off of Peter Fenwick's work. He is mentioned in this in regards to a survey that Claxton Oldsfield used that was adapted from Peter Fenwick's work. One of the things that has developed over time with our understanding in the history of ELDVs is to measure them properly. We have begun to use other historic measures surrounding the palliative care environment. Some of these, such as CBI scores, which are a bereavement index, are pulled from other areas of palliative care because it is believed, and the research supports, that ELDVs and end-of-life dreams and visions have affected in positive ways the CBI scores. So there is a large body of research and continues to grow that supports that end-of-life dreams and visions need to be normalized within the population. To normalize the research done on ELDV and to bring it into the more mainstream acceptance within the healthcare and palliative environment, it's important to look at the numbers. Some people believe that research and experimentation in ELDV is simply qualitative, but there are many quantitative studies, and most of them reveal well over 50% of patients and a significant number of relatives and an overwhelmingly large percentage of healthcare professionals all report ELDVs in some form. Some studies show 50, 60%. These are huge numbers within the psychiatric community. When significant percentages this high of patients and healthcare workers are reporting experiences with ELDVs regularly, study after study, over multiple studies, over multiple years, it shows that there is a distinct phenomenon that needs to be studied. There is even within ELDV research a fear that these occurrences are being underreported because of attitudes surrounding the events and the way that it is perceived by healthcare workers or family caregivers. But despite the many studies showing how important ELDVs can be to the spiritual needs of hospice patients and their families, there remains little training and education in the field. In the history of ELDV research, major findings have been stacking up over the last 3 decades. Particularly prior to 2000, there were some studies that really began to pull ELDV research into the realm of psychology and empirical science. Studies that found that healthcare workers were experiencing these things, and that these were not just delirium-oriented experiences. So that in 2022, this pilot study by Claxton Oldfield is very important because it brought training to the healthcare workers, gauged the healthcare workers' self-reports of how well they can handle talking to patients about end-of-life dreams and visions before and after. The other study that's very important to what we'll be discussing in the coming proposal is a study Levy et al. Did on post-traumatic growth and its relationship to ELDVs, pulling in that sure psychological construct out of other areas of hospice care. So on the slide, you also see that there's a section about categories. I put this together to highlight the lack of standardization currently going on in the industry of ELDV research. When there's a lack of standardization, it complicates cross research. There's also been quite a bit of consensus. And I put some of the highest points of consensus found in ELDV research on the slide. The biggest one being that ELDVs have a positive impact on the dying process of patients and the grieving process of their family. Within the hospice and palliative care environment, there is its own world in contrast to healthcare workers in general. Many healthcare workers deal with death on a daily basis. However, death in those environments is typically the enemy. And anything before that, especially in an emergency care environment, is considered positive. Whereas within the hospice and palliative care environment, death is no longer the enemy. Death becomes the end result. It's not necessarily a goal, but getting there smoothly, dealing with the emotions and the very difficult family situations, grief process from the patients, from their families is all important. One of the interesting things in studying hospice and palliative care is a study done in Korea by Han et al., where palliative care is beginning to develop and several features emerged. 133 concepts, multiple subcategories and categories are defined in this survey. And so in Korea right now, the hospice and palliative care environment is just forming. The other thing is that when we're talking about hospice and palliative care, I looked for a similar issue to ELDVs that would allow us to validate the measures that we're using and the method we use to get them. I found such a subject in terminal lucidity, and I put on the slide a little information of one study on terminal lucidity to give us an idea of how the hospice and palliative care environment does research. Although there is a lack of standardization within the ELDV research community, there are still some tools that are reused, and tools are constantly being created by researchers. Now, this makes for a low validity of the particular tools as they get adjusted and changed from study to study. It is part of my proposal to try to reuse many of the previously used surveys and tools to aid and to create more standardization within the field. So here are some of the tools listed. Now, many of them have names, but they have not necessarily been used with enough repetitiveness to create a high level of validity. One I would like to mention is one that I dubbed myself the Fenwick and Claxfield Oldfield Survey. And this is the one where Claxton Oldfield in one of their papers, in one of their research, took a Fenwick survey, a Peter Fenwick survey, and they reworked some of it and created another one, and they've used that several times. And so that particular survey on ELDVs is becoming one of the more used tools, although it hasn't been given any particular name or designation. I use this one, the Fenwick and Claxton Oldfield Survey, as a designator so that we can talk about it more in a concise way. The SELE is the chart pictured at the right, and it is one of the tools created by the SCRI. This tool gives an overall view of all of the different ELE or end-of-life experiences. Notice that deathbed visions and phenomenon is only one of many, and how it lands on the timeline is quite interesting. Many of the tools that we looked at on the previous slide were surveys, and they're going to follow a general Likert scale. Now, I took an excerpt of the main 17 statements for EOLE phenomenon of that Fenwick Claxton Oldfield survey, and I went ahead and put it on this slide because it is one that I'd like to use in my proposal, And this gets it in front of us and shows that even though it's a Likert-based scale, they're even evaluating it down instead of the 5 categories to 3 to help strengthen and show relationships and relevance. So another measured effect that we have seen was they're actually measuring post-traumatic growth within the hospice patients. And I believe that that could be measured as well within their families and potentially even healthcare workers themselves. Now here we're measuring and looking at ELDV experience perceptions contrasted with grief impact. And this study and this chart and information comes from a grant study in 2021. Now they look at their significant levels are listed, and this chart really shows how in-depth and how much information we can pull from these Likert scales in these studies. They've done an increase in comfort for patients and family caregivers, and then also they show that fear and anxiety are affected negatively with the experience and perceptions from ELDVs. Within this research, we can see sort of a gold standard emerging that when it comes to quantitative data, we can gather it and it can be assessed through the diagnostic and testing procedures we use on all phenomenon within psychology. Cross-cultural confounds and their effect on our understandings and the data we gather on ELDVs is an important part of the modern ELDV research. ELDVs take on a role within our understanding of human spirituality. So one of the things that is so important about spirituality is within the palliative and hospice care environment, there's already an understanding that it is a heightened time of spirituality. But how much does that heightened spirituality differ between religious environments and secular environments, between doctors and nurses, between all these very mitigating factors? So Nyblom's study was actually one done in Sweden, considered a highly secularized country. There, they found that the prevalence of ELDVs was just as prevalent, within well greater than 50% among those hospice patients were experiencing ELDVs. And so we take a look now at the Han study also, because it was a Korean study done with a beginning hospice care environment. And they weren't particularly looking at ELDVs, but even in that early hospice system, they found very similar constructs to what already exists within our Western hospice society. One of the more interesting studies goes to lend between doctors and nurses. They didn't actually have consensus on a lot, but they did have consensus that the use of an understanding of ELDVs is necessary for patient care. However, the nurses tended to favor spiritual explanations, and doctors tended to favor that these were deliriums, delusions, or something to do with neurotransmitter symptomology. This tends to move us on and give us a thought that at least among healthcare workers, and particularly doctors, there's a great deal of criticism of ELDV research. The criticism that I was able to research showed up 3 major criticisms, or 4. The first one is that being such a multifaceted experience within the human condition, death and dying and grief are going to be very hard to measure, and that extra effort has to be made to ensure that the measurements and the data coming out takes into account that multifaceted nature. Sample sizes are almost always very small. This is due to the fact that most hospice care environments themselves aren't very large. There have not been a lot of multifaceted studies done across many different hospice environments at once. Finally, there's the variety of sample. So that there's a lot of these tests that come out that are essentially looking at your atypical Christian Western environment. And they believe that this spirituality and religion may very well be influencing what people are experiencing at the end of life. And so they actually cite Niblam and I believe it's Kobayashi do cite that there need to be more studies in secularized countries. So that was sort of the background that Niblam took on the Swedish study that they did to help answer that set of criticisms. The final criticism is one that I've put more together myself from the information out of the other studies than one that it's been alluded to a little in some of the other studies, but there's really a lack of validity around the tools being used within ELDV research because they're not getting reused. Most surveys are specialized by the researchers, and though they're built off of previous research, there's some validity there. But what the field truly needs is to start seeing these models becoming more established, more used, with repetitive data that can be compared across studies. So this gets into that standardization that truly needs to happen within the field. So some of the established tools, the SELE, this modified PTGI scale used by Levy, and the CUEES developed by Claxton Oldfield, these are tools that can be used in multiple studies and hopefully will be in the future to help really establish more of that validity around the tool, that it's been used, that the measurements are repetitive across cultures and across groups, which is why I'm proposing to use all three of these within this proposed study so that, again, we can create a new environment in which they're used and establish the validity of those tools as well as gather data for the field. With all of the talk of criticisms and the weaknesses within the research, there needs to be a point where I defend the research. And this is sort of a culmination of a lot of the historical work on ELDVs at this point. ELDVs were originally sort of disregarded as delirium and hallucinations. However, the research now supports that these experiences are, according to Grant's study, qualitatively different. And one of the things that they found is that pain-reducing medications, they sort of eliminate these. They sort of get rid of them as far as if the medication is increased, so that the people go into maybe a deeper sleep. But the visions and conditions that they're receiving these are also markedly different from other forms of hallucinations and disorders. So with hallucinations, and deliriums, there tends to be fear, anxiety, so when medication is upped, they get worse. But when medication is reduced, the fear and anxiety hallucinations get better. They tend to be with less meaning. They don't have context for the person experiencing these hallucinations. And patients self-report a difference. So a patient will often talk about dreams and visions, these dreams and visions and ELDVs, in a sense of, I'm experiencing this in reality. Whereas when they talk about the hallucinations, they have enough cognitive function to say, I'm having a hallucination. I'm seeing a jellyfish in the corner of the room. The misconception that ELDVs are caused by delirium or hallucinations or neurotransmitters is such a confound to really getting the care that these patients need. Deppner and Grant, in their study in 2020, actually created this small chart. I've taken the whole chart and put it right in onto the slide so that it's just a real quick look at what they categorize as the differences between delirium and ELDV. It's not intended to be a diagnostic tool, but it's intended to be educational to help people really see that there is a qualitative difference between hallucinations and ELDVs. One of the interesting things that was done by Deppner et al. In their study is they actually recorded palliative performance scale reports from their patients, and they checked them. And before a patient could be interviewed about their ELDV, their PPS score had to be greater than 30%. And so what this means is that we're actually measuring their cognitive function prior to even moving into the interview process about ELDV. And so anyone whose PPS score was lower than 30%, that data was not used within the study, so that the study itself differentiates between those who are losing cognitive function and not having, or are not in touch with reality, and those who still are. One area that creates validity among the study of ELDVs is that researchers are not trying to put rose-colored glasses on the experience of ELDVs. When patients are experiencing fear and anxiety surrounding their end-of-life dreams and visions, that increases the negative coping mechanisms within the family and caregivers as well. So the thing is, it's not that negative ELDVs are rare. It's that they're a smaller percentage of the ELDV experience. It's not uncommon for the first ELDVs that hospice patients have to be scary. They've never experienced anything like that before, particularly as they're reassured by people with proper knowledge and an understanding that these are normal experiences. Those become much more positive, and typically they'll become much more positive experiences without that intervention. But we're seeing about a 60% positive and 20% distressing, according to one study by Claxton Oldfield. And again, it's not that they're rare, it's that they're a small percentage of the actual ELDVs. Proper care is so important when it comes to this negative effect of ELDVs. It's more common for the negative effects when the patients feel like they can't talk about the experiences because they're being treated as if they're delusional or they've lost their mind. And then they don't want to open up and they don't want to share those experiences, which causes the patient to close down during their palliative care experience and their dying event. There is an absolute need for awareness and training within the ELDV experience, especially among hospice and palliative care workers. One of the big issues and criticisms focuses on validity, and so when we talk about standardization, as human beings, we standardize when we train. If we don't create training and we don't teach a subject to people, standardization doesn't necessarily take place naturally. So right now, within the body of literature, there's several different terms just for what an ELE or an ELOP or a deathbed phenomenon is. The training creates the standardization and begins to create a framework of discussion. On top of that, we find that training has been mentioned in multiple studies as an end result of the study, because ELDVs are mostly negatively impactful to patients and families when they don't understand what's happening, or they feel like what's happening is unusual, or that it's their loved one is now delirious and they've lost their mind. Whereas when they understand ELDVs as a comforting spiritual part of the ELDV, of the dying experience, and the ELDVs themselves are a positive experience, then that creates post-traumatic growth within the patients, potentially within the family caregivers, and maybe even the healthcare workers. The proposed study, as part of this presentation, is a proposed study on the effects of ELDV training on recently established Korean hospice. And so this puts together culminates a lot of the previous historical research into a unique study done in a unique environment. So the proposed study is really going to assess the direct impact of that training and preferably evaluate it on the post-traumatic growth within the Korean hospice. So now the studies show that patients going through hospice, they often show signs of post-traumatic growth. And so that growth can be studied within the context of the ELDVs. Our research questions are basically this: will training for end-of-life dreams and visions increase patient post-traumatic growth? Will training for ELDVs increase the cognitive bereavement index scores in family caregivers? Does end-of-life dreams and vision prevalence and reporting support the historical data? And so this is that cross-cultural part of it. Now, really, the very first question listed is, will the training for end-of-life dreams and vision increase patient post-traumatic growth? That's the heart of it. But because of the way this is laid out, you'll end up getting data to answer the other two as well. It's also a mixed method approach. It's really the gold standard in psychology, and particularly developmental science today. But so there's a quantitative portion that we're going to discuss shortly that can be added to the study. To achieve and answer the questions asked about the effects of ELDVs on PTSG if hospice care workers are trained, we would be taking notes out of the Han study and trying to really recreate the same environment that they studied when looking at how that Korean hospice environment was developing. If we can potentially use that same model and now essentially gauge it, the first step would be to introduce post-traumatic growth testing in patients and to capture that baseline. At that time, we might even be able to add in the SELE and administer the first round of the Fenwick and Claxton Oldfield survey. At the same time, the hospice workers would need to receive copies of the SELE, particularly translated into Korean, and the CUEES pretest, and that standard test that checks to see if the hospice worker's level of confidence in dealing with the ELDVs patients are having. So all of this baseline gives us a view into where the hospice the Korean hospice and palliative care environment currently is. Once that is established, the next step would be to introduce training. And so the adaptation of the training from the American studies would be a key factor. Some of the big considerations here are going to be getting this pilot training module from Claxton Oldsville et al. And see if they would share that research tool, and then to propose that with Han and their research team to see if that training module can be translated not only in language but also in culture to the Korean environment. Now, this is an area where I would really love to see the narrative case study approach used by High-End to be introduced. And so this was a study done, an article written more than a study, and it's a case study by someone who works in dreams all the time. And they use a case study approach to really creating a tool for healthcare workers to understand the proper ways to listen and question the end-of-life dream and vision process to help alleviate any anxiety. I think a combination of that pilot training module and perhaps even just a copy of that case study as it is translated into Korean would be the training materials administered then to the Korean hospice workers. From there, then the testing begins again. Post-traumatic growth would then be measured on the hospice patients, and then the Fenwick and Claxton Oldfield survey would be re-administered. And a lot of the re-administering on the patients, we have to go back to the fact that this is a hospice care environment, and depending on how long implementation of the training takes, in the hospice care environment, you don't have necessarily the opportunity to once again go back and interview the same patients you started with. Very often they've completed their hospice and palliative care journey, they've passed away, and you may be able to get some more information or a follow-up with family members and family caregivers, but re-interviewing those patients just isn't part of how the hospice and palliative care system works. The post-training on the hospice workers, that is pretty simple. It's a re-administering of the CUEES after the test, after the training, to see how their confidence levels have increased. And that really validates that the training was somewhat effective in giving the hospice palliative care workers what they felt like they needed to be effective. Given that not all patients have ELDVs, there isn't a need for the quantitative testing and the quantitative interview until ELDVs are reported and that they are that the person agrees, or the family member, the patient, or the healthcare worker agrees to talk about the ELDV, and preferably it's the patient. But a lot of ELDV research does come from secondhand sources. And so what we find is within this study, you're going to gather a lot of data just in its implementation. If we're going to do the training, we have to get a baseline prior to the training and after the training. Does the administration of the CUEES directly answer our particular questions? Not really, because we're looking at what's happening with the patients. However, to ensure that that healthcare workers were actually trained, we now gather that data. In that same mindset, to make sure that the types of what's being reported as ELDVs is quantitatively the same as what we are experiencing in Western medicine, these brief interviews also create the validity that the experiences reported are the same types of experiences. And so we're actually drawing out this brief interview that was constructed by Deppner and Grant in their 2021 study. And it's a very short interview. And now follow-up questions are often used, but they're not scripted. So it's up to the actual interviewer to add in those. And so the interviews can become a little bit longer, but brevity is very important, especially when we're dealing with people who are going through the hospice and dying process. And so as part of that, we would actually be looking also to verify that the interview can be done by using that same greater than 30% PPS score and a CAM evaluation of the healthcare patients, just as Deppner did in the 2021 study. As an engineer, I've committed to and followed through with some very large projects before, but I've been an engineer for over 20 years. As a beginning psychologist, the size and the depth of this study is a little intimidating. But I think that all of these components have to come together to make good meaning of all the data. If you don't have the interviews to understand the quantitative information inside the ELDVs, we would not know if ELDVs in Korea and in this particular study were the same as the ones historically studied. If we don't test the workers for their competence prior to the training to after the training, we're not going to have a baseline that, yes, the training was actually implemented. And if we don't implement post-traumatic growth measurements within the hospice palliative care environment of Korea, then we're not going to be able to get the PTG scores that we need to be able to really measure the impact of ELDVs before the training and after the training among hospice patients and potentially family caregivers. There are so many challenges in the size and scope of this study, and I realize that. It's not something that I think can be boiled down smaller from its very ambitious scope. But once the training is completed in this Korean sample, it cannot be repeated. This is a very important move if it was made, and because the Korean lack of development is a one-time use item, and we will not be able to go back and recreate that same environment later. Another thing is that I could have tried to develop more tools on my own, but that's a real setback within this particular field, is that there needs to be standardization with the tools and how they are used. So I did not, within the scope of this study, break down which t-tests and which t-test samples, whether it's a two-tailed study or a single-tailed study, although it's pretty much from the outset of the research question, it's a one-tailed study. We're looking to see the growth within PTG and not really looking to see if there's a reduction in any of these. It would be unlikely, and if it is, it would be a real confound for how the study is being done. However, having said that, all of these tools were utilized within previous studies, and essentially I would be taking and trying to replicate what information, how they were boiling down and synthesizing that information. Whether I agreed with it or not, we would always have the original metadata to go back and try to use different SPSS techniques with. However, to create standardization within the field of ELDV research needs to be the goal of ELDV research, at least moving forward for the foreseeable future.